Hello, welcome. It's a real pleasure to host today Gita Gopinath, IMF Chief Economist, on Wheeler's Institute for Business and Development, fourth Rethinking Globalization series. Gita has been doing some amazing work as the Chief Economic Counselor of the IMF, doing some very topical research and outreach that touches the lives of many people, including, for example, inequality, sustainable development. And Gita, while you're doing this great work, COVID-19 hit the world economy. I think you coined it eloquently, the great lockdown. So thanks a lot for being with us. And my first question would be, we read recently the IMF forecast about the recovery, which seems, your forecast at least, predict to be asynchronous. So why don't you give us an update on that, especially given the dire developments in India, your home country?
The first thing to keep in mind, since this is first and foremost a health crisis that the world is grappling with, is if you look at global cases, there is a new peak now, a new record high in terms of global cases. More than 3 million people have died because of COVID-19. And so we're not out of the pandemic. The pandemic still exists, right? The question is, what do we expect going forward? Now, because of the fact that there has been, I would say, phenomenal success with vaccine discovery in terms of multiple vaccines being available, there is hope that we will exit this crisis at some point. Now, in terms of the numbers, 2020 was the biggest recession, biggest peacetime recession since the Great Depression. There are some countries that are recovering much faster. China already back to pre-pandemic levels in 2020. The US expected to be there very soon. And then you have many other countries of the world where they are seeing very slow recoveries. This is very different from after the GFC. After the global financial crisis, it was advanced economies that were more negatively hit, and not the emerging and developing economies. This time around, it's flipped around, and that's the big divergence that we worry about. And what is the source of these divergences? One, vaccine access. So while discovery has been great, access to vaccines has been highly inequitable. The second is the amount of policy support that was provided. This being a global crisis, you saw many countries stepping in with unprecedented policy support. And I believe the reason a financial crisis was averted was because you had all the major central banks of the world providing exceptional levels of liquidity. And because interest rates are still low right now and expected to stay low for a while, you have a situation where many countries, though their debt levels have gone up and they've had to borrow very heavily in this crisis, the amount of their debt servicing costs, their interest payments that they have to make have come down at the same time because of very low interest rates. Now that we're seeing these two speeds of recoveries, what kind of risks does that pose to emerging markets? And here, the first thing to keep in mind, of course, is that when you have stronger recoveries in any part of the world, firstly, that is good for other parts of the world because of just overall global demand going up. And if you have the closer trade relations you have with those countries, the more positive the effect is going to be. When you have the phenomenon we're seeing right now, which is 10-year Treasury yields rising, what is the impact on the rest of the world? And here I would say the lessons are the following. Firstly, the details matter about what exactly is driving that increase in interest rates. So if it is coming because of better news in terms of recoveries and better employment conditions, then that has a positive effect on the rest of the world, especially the more you trade with the country. And if anything, it encourages capital flows to emerging markets. On the other hand, if the increase in interest rates come about because of a surprise tightening by the monetary authorities in the US, kind of unexpected, which leads to higher risk aversion, that has a negative effect on emerging markets. You have capital flowing out, their spreads relative to US interest rates go up sharply, financing conditions tighten. So right now, at least what we have, given what you see what's happening with yields in the situation in emerging markets, I mean, I would say that the good is outweighing the negative. in terms of the fact that, markets are still in a good shape, easy financial conditions for many parts of the world. Now, of course, there are exceptions. There are some countries where that's not the case, where it's harder and financing costs are going up and exchange rates are depreciating more. But it's not something that we're seeing in terms of a systemic problem as of now. We have our estimate that in 2020, an additional 95 million people were classified as extreme poor relative to pre-pandemic projections. So that's, that is a reversal of 2 decades of reduction in global poverty that the world was seeing. We are now really seeing this increase. And this is a major, major concern. I think this is a major issue going forward, because a part of this diverging recoveries will mean that this problem will not get fixed very quickly. And we have about 50% of emerging markets and developing economies that before this pandemic were converging towards high income per capita levels are now expected to diverge over these next 3 to 4 years. So that's the dangerous divergence we're worrying about. And of course, it's not just cross country, but it's also within country. Even within country, we're seeing big differences in the the people who are getting affected by this crisis. Younger workers, lower educated workers, women in many sectors are just getting much harder hit. And that's a divergence that countries will have to deal with. And the reason I worry about it more is also because, even if the health crisis is over, what this pandemic has triggered is greater automation. And with greater automation, we know comes a period of greater inequality and diverging prospects within countries. And unfortunately, we haven't had the best of policies to deal with it in the past, but that has to change going forward. We've had problems that precede this crisis, which is rising inequality, which has been a big issue within countries. And that obviously has triggered the need to change policies to address this rising inequality. And I think this crisis has just made that so much more clear, that the importance of universal healthcare, the importance of universal access to broadband, all of this, basic livelihoods. I mean, all of that it's come out very starkly in this crisis. So this is, a very important issue that countries are having to address. Now, at the same time, I worry that, there has also been this big increase in nationalism. And when you look at especially vaccines and vaccine distribution, it's certainly, you see vaccine nationalism everywhere. And if you don't have production happening in your own country, the risks of export controls, the risk that you will not get the inputs when you need them are real. And that's, I think, where the world needs to do better in terms of, at least globally, coming together to solve some of these problems. So once we're past this pandemic and we're looking out, for me, what I see, of course, is the increase in inequality that the world has to grapple with. Now, there's going to be this increase in inequality, that's international increase in inequality, which the COVID crisis has created. But within countries too, you will see many more people bouncing back, but at the same time, you will have segments of the population that will be permanently hit by this crisis. And again, depending upon what the country is and the amount of support, fiscal support that could be given, you could see it very differently. So for instance, there are many small and medium enterprises that right now are benefiting from government support. And when, for instance, the moratoria on loan payments are withdrawn, our projection is that there will be very likely be an significant increase in bankruptcies, and that could put 1 in 10 jobs at risk. The second one, of course, is climate crisis. I mean, we've seen a pandemic crisis. Climate crisis is near and present. We are seeing, it was a concern before the pandemic. Thankfully, I'm seeing a lot of initiative on that front, people pushing to address the risks from climate change, to mitigate climate change. And so hopefully 2021 will be where countries actually walk the talk in terms of the amount of investments that they're doing in green technology and green infrastructure. A third big issue is on debt. Most countries almost all countries will exit this crisis with high levels of debt. Now, there are some, if you're a reserve currency issuer like the US and you have, or Europe, many countries there, you are able to borrow at low rates and you're able to have the luxury of time to bring down debt levels slowly as share of GDP. But there are many others that don't have that luxury of time. And for them, many of them will require continued debt relief. And this is what we're seeing right now. The policymakers will have a lot of issues, problems to deal with, but I think we should also give some credit for some of the successes that have happened, which is that, despite having a record recession in 2020, there was no financial crisis. And I think that is huge. And, I think going forward, you will have to continue to expect, especially major central banks, to very clearly communicate their intentions, do it in a very decisive manner to make sure that, financial conditions stay where they are. Second, on the vaccine front, remarkable success on vaccine discovery. But again, a lot more needs to be done on getting vaccine access to many parts of the world. Because many parts of the world provided large amounts of policy support to their people, even though many of them had lower incomes, their consumption levels were maintained, and this was true particularly in the rich world. So I think that's helped prevent social unrest. But in developing parts of the world, I do worry that where you don't have the space to provide this kind of support, that you could end up with social unrest that could then spill over into geopolitical tensions. And so again, I think the big takeaway is that this crisis is global. It needs global solutions, and countries really have to work even more closely together to make sure that the world as a whole comes out of this, not in a place with great divergences and with all kinds of geopolitical tensions.